Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I want to start with a question that should trouble us all. How did we arrive at a moment where the seizure of sovereign territory is being discussed not as an unthinkable crime, but as a negotiating position? Russia's recent warning that more Ukrainian land will be taken if peace talks collapse isn't just a threat. It's a window into the catastrophic failure of diplomacy, the dangerous logic of military escalation, and most importantly, the economic interests that have fueled this conflict from the very beginning. Let me be clear from the outset, what Russia has done in Ukraine, the invasion, the occupation, the destruction of cities and lives, is a violation of international law and human dignity. But if we stop our analysis there, if we simply repeat the mantras we hear in mainstream media about unprovoked aggression and evil dictators, we miss the deeper structures at work. We fail to understand how we got here, and more critically, how we might find a way out that doesn't lead to even greater catastrophe. Here's what you need to understand. This conflict didn't begin in February 2022, and it certainly won't end with simple moral pronouncements. The roots of this war lie in the economic and geopolitical competition between declining U.S. hegemony and rising multipolarity. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and NATO pursued what can only be described as an aggressive expansion eastward, despite promises, yes, promises, however informal, made to Soviet leaders that this wouldn't happen. Each wave of NATO expansion brought the military alliance closer to Russia's borders, incorporating former Warsaw Pact nations and even former Soviet republics. Now, imagine for a moment if the situation were reversed. Imagine if Russia or China had orchestrated a military alliance that absorbed Mexico and Canada, placing missiles and military bases along American borders. How do you think Washington would respond? Would we accept appeals to sovereignty and self-determination, or would we view it as an existential threat? This isn't whataboutism. It's basic geopolitical realism. Great powers have always, throughout history, been sensitive about their near abroad, about their sphere of influence. We can lament this reality, but we cannot ignore it if we want to understand what's actually happening. The economic dimension of this conflict is something that gets almost no attention in mainstream coverage, and that's precisely because it reveals uncomfortable truths about whose interests are really being served. The military-industrial complex in the United States has profited enormously from this war. Defense contractors have seen their stock prices soar. We've sent over $100 billion in military aid to Ukraine, money that ultimately flows to American weapons manufacturers. Meanwhile, European industries have been devastated by the cutoff of cheap Russian energy, forcing them to purchase expensive American liquefied natural gas instead. Whose economy benefits from a weakened, dependent Europe, who profits from an indefinite conflict that requires constant resupply of weapons? Russia's warning about taking more territory if talks fail is, in this context, both a military threat and a negotiating tactic. But here's the tragedy: the longer this war continues, the more territory Russia will likely control on the ground, the more leverage it will have at any eventual negotiating table, and the more Ukrainian lives will be lost. Every week of continued fighting strengthens Russia's position while weakening Ukraine's, yet we continue to hear rhetoric from Western capitals about fighting as long as it takes, and achieving total Russian defeat. This is magical thinking disconnected from the military realities on the ground. Let me address something that makes many people uncomfortable: the question of negotiations. There's a narrative that's been constructed that any call for diplomatic talks, any suggestion of compromise, is somehow appeasement, is somehow betraying Ukrainian sovereignty. This is both historically illiterate and morally bankrupt. Every war in history has ended in one of two ways: complete annihilation of one side or negotiated settlement. Given that Russia possesses nuclear weapons, the first option should terrify anyone with a functioning survival instinct. That leaves negotiation, which by definition means both sides make concessions they find painful. The Ukrainian people have shown extraordinary courage and determination in defending their homeland. But courage alone doesn't change the material realities of military capability, geographic proximity, and great power politics. Ukraine cannot defeat Russia militarily without direct NATO intervention, which would risk nuclear war. Russia cannot occupy and hold all of Ukraine without facing an indefinite insurgency that would bleed it dry. These realities point toward an ugly, painful, but necessary compromise, some form of territorial concession in exchange for security guarantees, neutrality provisions, and an end to the killing. I know this position outrages people on both sides. Hawks in Washington think I'm weak on Russian aggression. Ukrainian nationalists understandably see any territorial concession as betrayal. Russian nationalists want complete victory. But here's what I've learned in decades of studying economic and political history. The positions that make everyone angry are often the ones closest to realistic solutions. Moral clarity is important, but it cannot substitute for strategic wisdom. Russia's warning should be understood in this context. It's saying we have escalation dominance in this conflict. We're willing to take more territory, to inflict more suffering, to continue this war longer than you are. Whether that's a bluff or not, the consequences of calling that bluff are measured in human lives and risk of broader conflagration. The responsible position isn't to cheer for more weapons shipments and promise Ukraine indefinite support. The responsible position is to push for immediate ceasefire negotiations while Ukraine still has leverage, while Ukrainian cities are still standing, while Ukrainian lives can still be saved. But here's the deeper question we need to ask. Why is negotiation so difficult? Why do conflicts like this continue when the human cost is so devastating? The answer brings us back to economics and class interest. The people making decisions about this war, the people profiting from this war, are not the people fighting and dying in it. Ukrainian and Russian working class soldiers are the ones in trenches while defense contractor CEO get rich. Political leaders make tough speeches from safe capitals while villages are destroyed. This is the fundamental obscenity of war in our current system. Those who benefit are never those who suffer. Throughout history, we see this pattern repeat. The First World War was supposed to be over by Christmas. It lasted 4 years and killed millions, largely because no political leader wanted to be the one to accept a compromise peace, to admit the sacrifice had been for nothing. The same dynamic is at work in Ukraine. Western leaders have invested too much political capital in the narrative of Ukrainian victory and Russian defeat. To accept a negotiated settlement now would require admitting that perhaps the strategy of indefinite military support wasn't wise, that perhaps NATO expansion wasn't worth this cost, that perhaps a different approach could have prevented this catastrophe. Let me be absolutely clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying Russia was justified in invading. I'm not saying Ukraine should simply surrender. I'm not saying Western democracies are equivalent to authoritarian Russia. What I am saying is that geopolitics is more complex than good guys and bad guys, that understanding historical context doesn't mean excusing violations of international law, and that the paramount moral imperative right now should be ending the killing, not pursuing maximalist objectives that prolong it. The current situation is a nightmare scenario precisely because it combines legitimate grievances on multiple sides with zero. Some thinking, nationalist passion, great power competition, and enormous economic interests vested in continuation of conflict. Russia feels legitimately threatened by NATO expansion and Western economic sanctions designed to destroy its economy. Ukraine is legitimately defending its territorial integrity and national existence. The United States is legitimately concerned about international norms against territorial conquest. Europe is legitimately worried about its security, but legitimate concerns can lead to illegitimate actions, and more importantly, they can lead to irrational escalation where everyone loses. Russia's warning about taking more territory is a marker on the path of that escalation. Each step seems rational in isolation. Russia takes more land to improve its negotiating position. Ukraine requests more weapons to defend itself. The West provides those weapons to uphold international law. Russia escalates further in response, but the cumulative effect is movement toward a broader war that could engulf Europe and potentially go nuclear. At what point do we step back and ask whether we're sleepwalking into catastrophe? The answer, I believe, requires us to think beyond the narrow framework of this particular conflict. We need to understand this war as part of a broader transition in the global system, from U.S. unipolarity to multipolarity, from unchallenged Western dominance to a world where other powers have their own spheres of influence and their own economic models. This transition is inherently unstable and dangerous, much like the transition from British to American hegemony that required 2 world wars to complete. The question is whether we can manage this transition peacefully or whether we're condemned to repeat the catastrophic pattern of great power conflict. That's why Russia's warning should be heard not as a threat to defy, but as a signal that we're running out of time for a diplomatic solution. Every day of continued war makes compromise harder, makes the territorial and political issues more intractable, and increases the risk of miscalculation and escalation. The time for maximalist rhetoric and proxy warfare should be over. The time for hard-headed negotiation and painful compromise should begin. In closing, let me return to where I started. How did we get to a place where the seizure of territory is a negotiating position? We got here through decades of policy choices that prioritized military solutions over diplomatic ones, corporate profits over human welfare, and nationalist triumphalism over pragmatic coexistence. We got here through a failure to take seriously the concerns of all parties, through an assumption that history had ended and that Western liberal capitalism had permanently won. We got here through hubris, through the arrogance of the powerful, and through the ancient human tendency to solve disputes through violence rather than dialogue. But we don't have to stay here. We can choose a different path, one that recognizes that in the 21st century, with the weapons we possess and the interconnected economy we've built, everyone's security must be collective, or it is no one's security. We can choose negotiation over escalation, pragmatism over ideology, and human welfare over abstract principles that look grand in speeches but mean nothing to the dead. Russia's warning is a challenge to the international community. Will we continue down this path of military confrontation and economic warfare, or will we finally summon the political courage to pursue the only rational solution, a negotiated peace that gives all parties enough of what they need to step back from the abyss? The answer to that question will determine not just the fate of Ukraine, but the shape of international order for decades to come. The choice, as always, is ours to make. The question is whether we have the wisdom to make it before it's too late. Thank you.